Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. Good topic, let's do it. What's something effed up that happened to you in your childhood that you didn't really realize how bad it was until you were an adult? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. When I was 11 in 1971, a man snuck up behind me while I was playing pinball at my favorite arcade. He was standing really close and kept putting down dice so I could play more games. He asked me multiple times if I could feel that. I didn't feel anything except that it was strange that he was standing so close behind me watching me play. Every once in a while, he would press closer and ask again if I could feel that. I had no idea at the time what that was supposed to feel, as I could not actually feel anything. After some time, I said it was my time to go home, and he offered me a ride. As he dropped me off across the street from my house, he asked if I wanted to go to Disney World tomorrow and meet him at the arcade after school. As a good kid, should I tell my mom, a single mom with 4 kids, about this nice man I met? She showed concern and told me that if I ever see him again, I should run away and come straight home. I was in my 30s when I thought about this one day and realized I was super close to being kidnapped and probably molested by a stranger. I do wonder why he didn't, since he had me in his car, but I'm thankful that for whatever reason he chickened out. I hope he never tries again. I was 7 or 8 years old when my neighbor, a trusted friend of my parents, invited me over to have a piece of cake while his wife was out shopping. I was in his living room waiting for the cake when his wife came home early. He made me hide under the couch and told me to run home while he distracted her because she hated little kids. I didn't even think about it until years later when my brother told me about the guy and how he would give sweets for letting him touch his D. My dad's friend drove to the house when I was home, told me he had a Nintendo in his car, and invited me to check. I told him no thanks. When my dad got home, he said he had no idea who that person was, and he didn't have any friends come by that day. I forgot about it until my dad brought it up a decade later and realized that it could have been a lot worse. At my local YMCA, they would get all of the little girls 5 to 10 and have us gather in a room before swim class. We had to stand in a circle, undress completely, and switch into our bathing suits. There was always a man watching us do it. He was part of the staff, but he was not the swim coach. When I look back, it seems like a fever dream. My father brought me to the beach with a woman I didn't know when I was 3. We were living in the middle of Illinois at the time. It turns out he kidnapped me and drove me nearly 2,000 miles to his hometown. The woman turned out to be a 16-year-old girlfriend of his, and he was married to my mom for over a decade at that time. He was 35. He and my mom are still together 24 years later, and your guess is as good as mine as to why. My mom was telling me about this and told me the nickname the girl would call me, and the whole thing flashed back into my memory. Stepmom was only 9 years older than me when I was 8, and a couple of her friends would come over to hang out. The woman would almost always try to snatch my towel if I happened to walk by after a shower while giggling and saying how cute I was when I blushed. They babysat me once. We were at their house and they started playing music and let me drink a beer, then started to dance with me, both her and her husband. I puked on her after she spun me, and they called my parents to come get me. A couple of years later, it came out that they had been producing and distributing CP with their 3-year-old and his friends. They went to prison. It wasn't until I was about 16 that I realized how close I came to being in their films. Mother wasn't nurturing at all. One time when I was 6, I accidentally slammed my hand in the car door and it locked. I'm old. And I was crying and yelling because it hurt so bad. Mom was mad that I was making noise. Once she went back around and unlocked the door. She said we still needed to get groceries, so I should grab some ice from the seafood section and put it on there. There were multiple times where I'd fall rollerblading, have bloody legs, and cry, and she'd yell at me to get out of the house and not bring any dirt or blood in there. Never once hugged me after something like that. It came to light during therapy when my therapist was like, yeah, that's not super normal. Would you yell at a 6-year-old instead of helping them when they're injured? Oof. My dad is just reading it and realizing it now decades later. He had a major surgery and can't do much for himself. He said to me, "Your mother doesn't have a nurturing bone in her body." Yes, Dad. That is my childhood trauma in one sentence. I was 8 years old and had to drive my father across a lake of ice via ice roads because he was too wasted to drive. I thought it was awesome at the time, but now that I have a kid of my own, I would never have her do things like that. 17 years old, I got in a fight with my father again, and he threw a chair out the window and ran after me. I never ran so fast in my life. After that, he had a 3-hour rage inside his apartment until the cops finally showed up and tasered him. Alcohol. Well, I can identify or feel similar to how this poster felt. I had things like that happen to me in my youth, with my father as well. Yeah, and I agree completely, so good man. Hope you're doing all right. My grandparents used to kiss us on our private parts to show us how much they loved us. Ugh. My parents were raised with this behavior too, so it was normalized within our family. I also used to do the same to my younger cousins when we were kids to show how much I adored them. Imagine the horror when we got older and realized what this really was. I hate my grandparents. My sibling was highly abusive in every way. My parents chalked it up to sibling rivalry, and I thought it was normal for your older siblings to wish you dead, even attempt killing you, because my parents would just brush me off all the time, even when I was 11, and told her my sibling tried to suffocate me with a pillow and then beat me for crying. I was always made out to be the dramatic one, the liar, or the sneaky one. I didn't know what golden child was. We didn't have that term growing up, and if we had, I wouldn't have thought it applied to my older sibling because they were punished for their misdeeds unless it involved abusing me. I jokingly started talking about this to 2 women I was friends with who were siblings, and they looked at me like I had grown an extra head. When I was in 2nd grade, I overheard a female classmate talking about having had sex. It may have been bullshitting for all I know, but at that age, people don't make up sex stories to look big like a teenager would. I don't remember thinking much of it at the time because I didn't know the implications. But I look back on it now, realizing that I heard a 7-year-old talking about being molested. It makes me sick and sad. 1980, grade 10. I'm walking home from school, standing at a busy intersection, waiting for the light to change. A kid ran by me against the light and into traffic and got hit by a car. I was only slightly aware of it happening. I heard the crash, then turned my head to see him pinwheeling through the air. He landed perfectly upside down, with a sickening crunch directly on his head. I ran over to him where he was face down in the street, rolled him over and cradled his head in my lap. There was blood pouring out everywhere. I recognized him as a popular senior who was on several sports teams, but I didn't know his name. He was looking up at me with these incredibly blue eyes, with a mixture of shock and confusion. As I watched, his eyes went from bright blue to medium blue to dull gray as life leaked out of him. His lips moved wordlessly. He made a gurgling sound and then he went limp. Sometime later, the EMTs arrived, and after quickly searching for a pulse, they announced him dead and didn't attempt resuscitation. When they picked him up to put him on a gurney, the back of his head opened like a trap door, and some brain matter fell onto the pavement. The EMTs gave some towels to mop up the blood I was covered in. The cops took my statement, and I was sent home. As I walked through the crosswalk where it happened, I saw the kid's Adidas sneakers, laces still tied, 1 pace apart, not even knocked over. When I got home, my mom was initially mad at me for ruining my pants until I explained what happened. We never really spoke of it again. I largely forgot about it. No one got counseling in those days. 1994, 14 years later, my wife and I are watching Star Trek The Next Generation, and there's a scene where Geordi is connecting some cables to Data's head. And when he clicks a button, a flap opens up on his head, and I effing lost it. I was sobbing uncontrollably, and I scared the shit out of my wife. I needed multiple counseling sessions to handle the emotions surrounding the event that I had never dealt with at the time. When I was young, my brother and I were at the bus stop. We got jumped. One of them was holding me on the ground while the other grabbed the biggest stone he could and was carrying it over to drop on my head. My brother fought them off until one of them had him in a bear hug from behind, and as I was wearing steel-toed boots, I ran over and kicked him right in the tailbone as hard as I could. We fought for a while longer, but then everyone left. At the time, it was just another day for the ostracized kids. Now it is. They were going to kill us, but we fought like hell and got out of it. Adrenaline kicks in even now thinking about it. We lived overseas in the military. My parents, my mother, and stepfather were having major issues. We lived off base. My stepfather moved from base to barracks, which sent my mother into a spiral. She threatened to kill herself and ended up in the mental health part of the hospital, which was also on base. Let's just say that once their marriage fell apart, my stepfather didn't give a shit about us. My brother, sister, and I lived alone for weeks. We were 16, 14, and 5. I'm in the middle. Nobody checked on us. Nobody noticed. We would go to my stepfather's office to get money or have things signed. We visited my mother at the hospital. She told us not to tell anyone because she was afraid we would be taken away. The only transportation we had was the school bus, which took us from our house to our base school. So anything we needed on base had to happen during school hours, meaning skipping school. Once we got dropped off at home, we could just walk to the local store if we needed something. Once she got better, she filed for divorce and we moved back to the States. The deadbeat stepdad never once checked on us at the house. I'm sure the only reason he gave us money was because when he showed up at his job, he did not want anyone asking questions. I wasn't given affection, really. Then, as I got older, I would see friends bring out their childhood photos. I'm talking these kids had albums, memorabilia, baby books with their hands and footprints on them. The worse my relationship became with my parents, the more I thought about the fact that didn't take time to do things that parents seem to do. One day I asked my mother, and her not having an answer sent me into some sort of trauma rage. A few years back, my cousin and I were reminiscing about how we lived together when we were 4 in a rough neighborhood, and our moms would have us play a game of who can play on the floor. It wasn't until that moment that I realized it was there because gangs in our neighborhood, and they wanted to prevent us from getting shot. My dad kidnapped us when I was in 2nd grade. We were supposed to be going to visit my grandparents, my dad's parents, halfway across the country for a week with our dad. After being there for a couple of weeks, which we of course didn't notice being kids on vacation, we were informed my parents were divorcing and we would be staying with our dad in our grandparents' basement until it was over. What we didn't know is that my mom had no idea he was doing this. He just didn't bring us back. Then she got served with divorce papers. The worst part is that my older brother and I are technically his stepchildren and our sister's half-siblings. So he has no legal right to keep us from our mom. Somehow nothing was done. We ended up being there for nearly a year while my parents duked it out and in court, and my mom eventually won primary custody of all of us. And we got to move back home. I didn't find out about the whole story until I was an adult. I did martial arts as a kid. There was some dude that also did it that was like in his 30s or 40s. He had special needs and was super sweet. He and I got along well because he was basically a giant 10-year-old. One time, he put his hand on my thigh briefly. It was long enough for me to notice, but not for it to really set off any alarms in my 10-year-old head. However, after that, my mom had a talk with me about him and him touching me, and the other adults seemed to be more present whenever he was hanging around us. To the best of my knowledge, he never did anything bad. I like to think that he was innocent and he was crestfallen because he was a really nice dude. When I was 12, I stayed the weekend with some salt-of-the-earth, live-off-the-land friend of my aunt and uncle in eastern Oregon. If you know the region, then enough said. They had many animals, and all the animals had jobs. The dozen or so cats kept rodent population under control. There was one cat that apparently wasn't earning its keep, and the dad had plans to kill it. We went out with a rifle and caught it, but unsurprisingly, the cat freaked out and started clawing, biting, and scratching the dad, and all that. And I watched while he proceeded to beat this cat to death by swinging it by the tail against a tree. I buried it with my son. It seemed like farm life at the time, but it has found a new way of creeping up and later in life. One day when I was maybe 12 years old, I was home alone and hanging out in our finished basement, as I often did. Upstairs, I heard the front door open, and I was about to call out and say hi when I heard something that gave me pause. It was my father's voice, followed by my unfamiliar woman's voice. I don't know why, but something about it just felt off to me. I decided to just stay quiet downstairs. They eventually left, and when my father came later that time alone, I greeted him as if nothing odd had occurred. A year later, I started to become aware of the problem in his family that would ultimately lead to my parents' rather hostile divorce another 4 years later. I relatively quickly forgot all about that strange occurrence, and I never told anyone about it. Fast forward to one day when I was 21. I had just gotten into a massive argument with my father. Now 4 years later, we're still not on speaking terms. He sent me a rambling wall of text messages, derailing all the ways he seemed to think my older brother was the reason for the divorce. I showed the text to my mom and asked for her side of things. She told me that several years before the divorce, and 6 years before I was even aware of my problems, they started having their issue. Eventually, they started seeing a marriage counselor, and with help, they decided to try an open relationship. They agreed to 7 rules regarding that arrangement. If my mom said that my father broke 4 of those rules with the first month, one that was that they would never bring their own SP into our home, and she said he broke that one while I was home. As soon as my mom told me that, I was reminded of that unknown voice I'd heard 9 years earlier. It's impossible to say, but I just have this terrible gut feeling about how well those pieces fit together.